Welcome to Beyond Sunday School. Glad to have you here this week. And we are into episode 2 of the background of the New Testament. And we record this live on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock via Zoom. So if you are interested in being a part of the live recording, would love to have you join us. Just let me know, and I'll make sure that you catch the link to the Zoom recording session. And if you are a part of that, then you get to ask questions and be a part of some of the discussion that you may hear throughout the evening. And so there are a couple folks who are on watching this week, and so you may hear some voices, and that's who they are. And you too could be a part of that. So let me pray, and then we will dive in here. Heavenly Father, thanks for tonight as we spend some time looking at the background of the New Testament. I pray that this information would help us to know and understand the scriptures a little more deeply so that we might be changed. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Hey, so last week we looked at the political world of the first century there surrounding the time of the New Testament. And this week, we are looking at the social and economic world. And just so for those of you that may be jumping in here with this episode, we are kind of working our way off of the New Testament survey by Merrill C. Tenney. And that was published by Erdman's. So I'll make sure to include a link to this in the show notes. So if you want to grab the book, that would be great. But that's kind of, we're following his outline. So this week we are looking at the social and economic world. Now, one of the reasons we want to make sure that we kind of wrap our minds around the social and economic world is because a significant part of studying the scriptures, of trying to understand what is happening there and then how to apply them to our lives, is being able to see the places where the Bible, the culture and society of the Bible parallels and intersects our own. And so just like last week when we looked at the political world, you can begin to see some of those intersections, some of those ways where, some of those places where their kind of leadership, their kind of, the role of empire and how that begins to play throughout the story of the scriptures. You can begin to see how our current world mirrors some of that. And it provides these good opportunities for us to make these connections and be able to pull the scriptures into our time, our place, and apply them in a very specific way. And so the same is going to be true here for the social and economic world. I think as we walk through this, you'll begin to see some of those places where there are these intersections, where there are these moments where you go, oh, that sounds familiar. That's kind of like how it is here in America in 2021, 2000 years later. It's an amazing thing to realize that the world hasn't changed all that much in 2000 years. People are people, and societies tend to structure in some very similar ways across the ages. So, for instance, as we dive in here, the reality is back, in the first century, they had wealthy people, they had poor people, they had people who were in a budding middle class. There were people who the religious folks really despised and hated. There were people who were on the fringes of society. There were people who were very religious and were sucking up to those in political power. So, as much as the world has changed, the world has stayed the same. So, as we walk through this, we're gonna look at a couple of things. First, we are going to look at Jewish society and kind of how is Jewish society structured around the New Testament time. Then we're going to look at the non-Christian society or Roman society. How is it kind of structured? How did how did things kind of work through there? We'll look a little bit at culture and what were some of the cultural developments that happened during this time, and and then we will look at finance, transportation, and travel, just to try to help us get our minds around what was this world like that Jesus and his disciples and the apostles in the book of Acts were living in. So, what about let's start here. The Jewish society. What was it like? Well, Jewish society and the non-religious society were pretty similar in the sense that you had a wealthy aristocracy, and then you had the poor and some middle class. Now, in Judaism, in Jewish society, the aristocracy was made up by religious elites. So these would be, like your high priests. You read in the Gospels. As we get into the Gospels, we'll learn about something called the Sanhedrin, which was kind of this high council of Jewish religious elites that was comprised primarily of wealthy landowners. And so while pagan society wasn't necessarily organized around religion, Jewish society was. And so it was, so you had your chief priests and their families. You had leading rabbis, you had the leading Pharisees. These kinds of guys made up the aristocracy. And they kind of were, in a sense, the virtual rulers of Judea. And we catch that flavor in the Gospels when you read through and you find out, especially as we're recording this on the Wednesday after Easter. And where was Jesus taken first? He was taken to the Sanhedrin. He was taken to this court. These were the people who kind of ruled Jewish society. So, you could look at some of the key figures, some of the guys that we know about who were on the Sanhedrin. Would have been Nicodemus, who Jesus talks to in John chapter 3 it is. And then you get Joseph of Arimathea, who donated his tomb for Jesus's body. I mean, these were some heavy hitting guys, and the Sanhedrin had all kinds of power. So you have that, but then you have the majority of people who were poor. They were the working poor. They were farmers and artisans, some businessmen. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Jewish society is slavery was pretty much non-existent. There just wasn't a lot of slavery going on within Jewish society, and this was probably because of how just how Jewish society worked, with the commitment to Torah and caring for one another and helping each other. And there was this greater sense of communal identity. So even though most of the people in the area were poor, they were able to help and keep one another from falling into slavery. And so most of the people in Palestine at the time were freedmen. And that's a really significant thing, because that is not the case in broader Roman society. And we'll get there in a minute. Social divisions among the Jews. Well, actually, I'm going to read this little paragraph here from Tenney, because I think it's important, and I think it gives us a good sense of what's going on. He says, social divisions among the Jews were somewhat restrained by the common obligation which the law imposed upon its followers. If they were all equally responsible to God for obedience to it, they were consequently morally equal in his sight. Although the Jew regarded the wealthy man as especially blessed by God's favor, and therefore as righteous, there was no reason why any man should not by good works merit equal favor. While an aristocracy tends to be self-perpetuating, there was at least the inherent moral equality which kept the Jewish oligarchy from becoming too oppressive. So, what he's saying there is that commitment to the scriptures, commitment to the Old Testament, commitment to the law kept Jewish society moral. And that morality was seen primarily through a lack of oppression of the poor. So you had a trust, you had a connection between the aristocracy, between the wealthy elites and the poor. There was some connection there, a unifying force through the scriptures and through their identity as God's chosen people. And so the wealth dynamics, the societal kind of separations and things that we see in Roman society were much more muted in Jewish society because of that driving religious force. Now, pagan society or Roman society, how is this structured? Well, first they had an aristocracy, a clear aristocracy, and it was the stratas that we're going to talk through here as far as how the society was structured. They were clear, they were defined, and you landed in one of these, and there really wasn't a lot of moving up. If you fell out, it was very difficult to move back up. So if you were a part of the aristocracy and something happened where you lost your wealth, your stature, your power, it was very, very difficult to then rise back into those ranks. And so as a result, the aristocracy did everything they could do to protect their power, protect their money, protect their pride of position within within the society. This was absolutely a critical thing. So this aristocracy controlled all the public lands. They controlled they controlled everything. As Rome went to war and would conquer new places, this rich aristocratic class of people would take control of various parts of the land. They would take over businesses. They would take over all the best they could. And so they were exploiting, they would exploit every aspect of a conquered people for their own financial profit. And as a result, I mean, they lived, if you were an aristocrat in Rome in the first century, you lived a great life. You lived a life of luxury. You lived the kind of life that, the American dream is made of, right? I mean, you were living high on the hog, and it was amazing. So from there, they had a middle class. This middle class was, for us in America, when we think of the middle class, we think of a working class that is built through industry, right? The middle class in America came about primarily through, in a huge way, through the auto industry. And this, people being able to go work on the line, work 8 hours, make not just a living wage, but make enough money to be able to have recreation. So they weren't working multiple jobs anymore. They had, they had retirement savings. They had all these kinds of, all of that was developed through this working class, and it built a middle class in our nation. Now in Rome, that's not how the middle class was born. The middle class in Rome was developed primarily because of slavery. So as Rome conquered more and more people, as Rome conquered more and more nations, took more and more people captive, their numbers of slaves rose. And as times got harder, then you had people who were freedmen falling into slavery. Slavery was a way to pay off debts and that kind of thing. And so you have this development of the middle class that is just it's built on it is built on the back of slaves. The problem, though, one of the things that happened in Rome was the middle class was by and large also the war class. They were the warriors. They were the ones that were filling the Roman legions. They were the ones that were filling the military ranks. And through Rome's constant war, the middle class almost completely disappeared. So even though one existed, it was small, and it did not carry a lot of power. The arguably one of the largest groups, it were called the plebes, and these were the poor people. These are the people that were just trying to get by.
Plebes.
So
plebeians.
Plebes.
Yep. Plebs. The plebes or plebeians. Yep.
Yeah.
They were.
And
These were people who were living, hand to mouth. Their living conditions were horrid. They were completely given over to whoever would come into power and would promise them, food. Basically, if you wanted to angle to come into power as the emperor, or move up into power in the Senate, you had to prove, you showed that you were going to be the one, and you made the promises that you were going to be the one who was going to provide bread and circuses for the masses. The mob. This is the mob. This is the these were people that had no employment. They had no, or if they did have employment, it was intermittent. And honestly, the plebes had it worse than slaves, because if you were a slave, at least you had food, at least you had clothing, at least you had a place to live. The plebes in Rome had none of those things promised to them. And so you can imagine when you have
largest group,
tens and tens and tens and tens of thousands of these people.
Yeah.
What
This is the largest group.
Yeah, this is the largest group. They made up as the biggest part of the population, right? I mean, now when I say biggest, it's by a small factor, because slaves were right there with them. They estimate that less than half of Rome's inhabitants were free men. So think about that for a minute. The largest empire in the world, and they figure less than half were free. The majority were slaves. And so these numbers of poor and slave, they go, I mean, they're right there with each other. And so it's just a crazy thing. Now, when we talk about Roman slaves, we also have to understand that we're probably in many cases, we're not talking about the kind of chattel slavery that we saw in the American South, right? The slaves in many of the slaves in Rome, not that their conditions were good or that it was good to be a slave, but their role was different. They weren't necessarily doing manual labor. They weren't necessarily out in a field somewhere. Many of the slaves were teachers. Many of the slaves were writers, were philosophers. They were in the employ and they were enslaved by the aristocracy and the rich. And so, they would, publishers would have slaves doing copying and as working as copyists. So some of these slaves who were brought in from conquered territories were, educated, were, so when we think about the slavery in the first century, we have to understand that it is a mixed bag. Some of it was chattel slavery. Some of it was the kind of awful slavery that we see in America, at our founding. But some of it was this really weird kind of slavery where, they would conquer a nation and they take their intellectuals as slaves and use them to train and teach their children. So it was a very strange environment. So one of the things we have to also recognize is that slavery is ever present in the New Testament. It's just there. It's like water to a fish. It is present as a background thing. And so this is why in household codes, you will see in the Bible, you'll see in the New Testament, Paul talking about masters, this is how you treat your slaves. Slaves, this is how you treat your masters. You have Paul writing in Philemon to a slave owner about his runaway slave Onesimus. And now, how, as a follower of Jesus, do you deal with that issue? So so it's hard for those of us with modern sensibilities. We want the Bible to come out with a clear moral statement on slavery that's not there, not in a definitive kind of way, right? Not in the same way that we see on some other moral issues. However, the principles of following Christ didn't really create an environment that was conducive for slavery. And we see that clearly in Paul's letter to Philemon. He is very subtly, but at the same time, clearly, explaining to Philemon that Onesimus is his brother in Christ, and that changes things. So another paragraph here that I want to read, that because Tenney does a good job of handling this question of slavery. He says, the institution of slavery is reflected in the New Testament by the frequent use of the term slave and by occasional references to the ownership of them. Nowhere in its pages is the institution attacked, nor is it defended. According to Paul's letters to the Asian churches, there were both slaves and slave owners who were Christians. The slaves were enjoined to obey their masters, and the masters were commanded to not be cruel to them. Such was the power of Christian fellowship, however, that the institution of slavery gradually weakened under its impact and finally disappeared. So so you see this erosion of slavery as a result of the self-understanding of Christians as brothers and sisters. How do you enslave your brother and sister? This changes the entire dynamic, and this is the dynamic that we see Paul, really working hard to help people understand as he's shaping identity through his letters, is to understand that they are part of a family. Now, if you've got a ton of people that are unemployed, that are poor, that are out of work, what are you going to have? You're going to have crime. You're going to have a lot of it. And we catch a sense of the immoral character of Roman society in Romans chapter 1, 18 through 32. There was nothing in Roman society to call people back to a moral uprightness. And so in Romans 1, 18 through 32, we have Paul kind of describing the state of morality at that time in Rome. And it is not an overstatement. It was bad. Like there just was nothing to call people back to some moral standard. Everybody was living in a way that was right in their own eyes. We're kind of going back to the Judges a little bit there. And so you can just imagine if you have a huge percentage of your populace that is out of work, that is poor, they are going to do whatever they need to do to get theirs. And that's what you see in Rome. And so it's this in Roman society, crime was ever present, and it was a pretty significant issue. So that's kind of the structure of the social world. Now, as far as cultural attainments, kind of what did we see culturally develop? Well, in literature, you have some under Augustus. There was a literary revival in Rome. The most important person there is Virgil. He wrote the Aeneid, and you have Ovid, you have Horace. There's this Renaissance under Augustus. After him, there's just not a lot. Seneca wrote some. He wrote some moral philosophy. But there's just not a lot after that. Rome, by and large, just wasn't. It wasn't a writing literary. It wasn't really a literary empire. It wasn't what they were about. In art and architecture, that's a little bit different story, right? They were the architecture of Rome exists to this day. Some of the Roman roads that were built in the last century before Christ, or into that first century, some of those roads are still being used to this day. They were built so well, and the way they built them is they would dig it out, they would take off a good layer of topsoil, and then they would lay down they'd lay down kind of this road, it's kind of road peat, I guess you could call it. I don't know. I don't know how you want to lay out those words. Let's see. What's the right word here? Let's put my fingers on it. So they would they'd fill it with road bed. They'd fill the road bed with 3 different layers of road material. And then they would crown the center of the road so that water would roll off. And then they would top that with stone to pave. So you have these roads that were just an unbelievable feat of architecture. And it's unbelievable. Along with, the bridges, the aqueducts, the theaters, the baths, they had mastered the use of the arch, which is, it's one of the most solid structures that you can build. And the testament to their architectural prowess is that their buildings, their bridges, their aqueducts, their roads still exist today. And the Colosseum, was built in AD 80 under Titus, right? I mean, and you can go see the Colosseum today. It still stands, which is an amazing thing. They weren't so much into art, necessarily as far as painting and that kind of thing. Some of their statuary is still around, still in existence. It was very pragmatic, very very much tried to get at the realism of things, but really really the architecture is what stands out. Music and drama in Rome was very base. It was it wasn't, you don't have any Mozarts or Bachs or Beethovens coming out of Rome. Music was just kind of it was coarse and cheap. That's the best way you can put it. So was the drama. So was the plays. They were usually street plays. They were usually things just to try to entertain the masses, to try to take their minds off things. And they were base. They were most of it was just kind of making fun of things, mocking the world they found themselves in. And it just wasn't that great. There's just not a lot of staying power. The arena is significant. The arena was where the gladiators would fight, and some of those gladiators were trained, and their goal was to become rich and famous, just like our boxers or our MMA fighters today. But they would oftentimes fight slaves, captives of war, condemned criminals. They were, and the whole thing was just to entertain the masses, to keep them occupied and focused on other things. And so it was, it was brutal beyond comprehension. And so movies like Gladiator are pretty, they're not that far off at the kind of brutality that you saw in the arena. So the language of the time, there were 4 primary languages being spoken in the New Testament times. You had Latin, which was the language of the law courts and the literature of Rome. So if you wanted to kind of show your intelligence, your wisdom, show that you were smart and educated, you spoke and wrote in Latin. Greek was really the lingua franca, or the common language. And so, for instance, we don't have early writings of the New Testament in Latin, but the New Testament is primarily written in Greek. Along with Greek, at least in Palestine, you had Aramaic and Hebrew as being significant language sets. So, Aramaic was the predominant tongue of Palestine. Of Jesus most certainly spoke Aramaic, probably also spoke Greek as he was engaging with Gentiles. So those were kind of the big ones. Then you have Hebrew, which was, again, Hebrew was to Palestine as Latin was to Rome. Classical Hebrew, was no longer, it was basically a dead language at this point. It was, used in the temple, used in the synagogue. It had been lost really probably since the time of Ezra. And so the rabbis used it. And so you needed to be an educated elite to use Hebrew. Now, that said, so when Jesus was put on the cross, the sign over him, King of the Jews, was written in 3 languages: Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. And so all 3 of those languages in Palestine would have been read, known, and understood. So it's a fascinating thing to consider, the reality that as we read back through, probably every person you read about in the New Testament was trilingual. They probably knew some Latin, they certainly knew Greek, and they certainly knew Aramaic, which is mind-boggling, because most of us can barely speak English, and to learn a second language in America is like, wow, you can't believe you did that. That's amazing. But this was, these were not stupid people. Sometimes we look back on history and think that we're so much smarter than folks from the first century. But we need to understand these were trilingual people. They could, at the very least, speak some of 3 languages. They probably read fluently in 2 and spoke fluently in 2, which is a remarkable thing. One of the other things that's interesting about Aramaic is church tradition says that some of Jesus's earliest sayings were probably written down and circulated in Aramaic. Those source documents were probably what were used for the writing of the Gospels. So that's a pretty amazing thing. And then, along with the reality of Greek being this common language, the New Testament being able to be circulated in Greek, that was something that both Jew and Gentile could read and comprehend and understand. This was such a unique and important time in history, that the known world was so unified with a singular language set, which was pretty amazing. Now, as far as science goes, not a lot was happening here. Most of the science that, especially as far as we think of modern science, just wasn't really a thing. The Romans pretty much were building and using the work that had been done by the Greeks, by and large, and the Egyptians. So, they just didn't make a lot of big strides. By the time that we get to the New Testament, like, everybody knew the world was spherical. Everybody, they knew that it spun on an axis. Like, they had figured all of that stuff out. The Greek scientists had figured all of that out. What the Romans were most concerned about was geometry. And that was because they used it to map out land and to divide it and to organize land. That literally was what they were most into. So that was probably the biggest, the thing that they just kind of used the most. And then schools, education. How did education come about? One last thing before we move away from science. What's really important about this is we need to understand that we live in a scientific age. The New Testament, the Bible, was written in a rhetorical age. What they cared most about were rhetoric. They cared most about making a good argument and convincing other people of your argument. This was the height of education, which we'll get to next. Science, especially science, the way we think of science, just was not a concern. It was not a part of their world. And so we need to understand that, especially the Old Testament and the New Testament, those books, those writings are not interested in those questions that so often we as moderns bring to them. They're not science texts. They're not there to make scientific claims or defend scientific claims. And so it's not that they're anti-scientific. It's just not what they're about. They're about different stuff. And so we need to recognize that as a society, the questions they were asking were very different than the society that we live in and the questions that we are asking. And so so while we talk about, finding those places of, where we intersect, we also understand there are places where we're going the opposite direction. And they just weren't asking the kinds of questions that we moderns ask about science, and even the way they write and think about history, right? We write and think about history in a scientific way. They did not. They wrote and thought about history in a rhetorical way. They did history for the purpose of telling family stories and shaping identity and trying to help people understand who they were, where they were, and when they were. They were not necessarily trying to do history in the way we do. And so when we approach, we just have to be aware of these things as we approach the Bible. Education, by and large, was privately done. If you were an aristocrat in Rome, you had a slave that taught your children, and there were some schoolrooms, that wasn't the norm. Roman boys were by and large taught and educated by these private tutors until they went to places. There were universities, right, like the university in Tarsus and some of those other places where they would go to get more advanced education. And so, it was a very different style, and really to be truly educated, you needed to be wealthy. So while they were significantly intelligent, they could speak 3 languages and these kinds of things, the formal education is not the same kind of formal education that we think about today. So a lot of the education that was done, especially as they went into maybe some of these smaller schoolroom settings, they were done by memorization, repetition. They were just kind of given the information. They would repeat it and repeat it and repeat it, and oftentimes they were forced to just remember it and regurgitate it through, with the use of corporal punishment if they screwed up, if they made mistakes. Safe to say they did not have good quality educational psychology. They didn't really, they didn't have the kind of great teachers that we have today. That's for sure. This was oratory was huge. So these students would memorize poems and epic poems, and they would be expected to recite them perfectly, and not just recite them in some wooden kind of way, but to recite them with the appropriate emphasis and feeling and all that kind of stuff, so they could show that they understood the poetry. So this was kind of the emphasis. Jewish education was pretty similar. Their curriculum was more focused in the Old Testament. they basically taught through the synagogue and with the scriptures. So that was kind of where education landed. Moral standards. Crime was the only news of the day. It was just not a great time morally. Palestine was a little different than the rest of the Roman world because of the influence of the Jewish scriptures. But by and large, moral depravity was just kind of everywhere. Human life was cheap. It wasn't worth much of anything, particularly girls in Roman society. There was a guy named Hilarion wrote to his wife, Alice. He said, "Should you bear a child, if it is a boy, let it live. If it is a girl, expose it." And this was kind of the attitude. So, you'd take a girl and just set it on the side of the road, and that would be that'd be it. And so one of the things in the early church that the early church started doing is when Romans, when Roman citizens would do that, folks in the early church would go and would collect the children that were left exposed, that were left to die, and would raise them as their own. And this was one way in which the church grew. This is a great example of the ethic of life that has been a part of the church from the beginning. So corruption was everywhere. Corruption in politics, debauchery in the pleasures, fraud in business, deceit, superstition. It was the Roman world was just an absolute mess. So how about the economic world? Well, it was kind of similar in some ways to our world. They lived in a workaday world. They lived in, you'd go, you'd work, and you'd make your money, and you would work. You'd work sun up, sundown, and it was a hard way to go. There wasn't a lot of recreational time. There wasn't a lot of downtime. You were working. The primary things that we see in as far as their economics was agriculture. The world was different 2,000 years ago. There was a lot more farmland. Places like North Africa, which is now, basically a desert, had huge farms with cattle grazing and fruits and vegetables. And so there was a lot of agriculture that was being done in the empire. Industry, manufacturing wasn't really a thing. Wasn't that big of a deal. You had some industry being done, some things being put together, but it wasn't anyone that was trying to produce some mass goods like copper, small wares, furniture, generally were produced by local craftsmen. And if they're trying to do more, they would use slaves. So it's not like they were not an industrialized people. A lot of the luxury goods were imported from Africa, from the East. They'd bring in gold, ivory, rare wood, pearls and jewels came from India, furs from Asia and Russia. Amber came from the far north. Like this was kind of where they brought things in from. Now, money, the way money worked was really interesting. Is kind of, and we catch glimpses of this in the gospel narratives. So there were two units of measure in the Roman Empire. You had the denarius and you had the aureus, or a pound. Now, 1 pound was worth 40 denarii. And so the denarius is probably one you've heard a number of times because it's mentioned quite a bit in the New Testament. Sometimes it gets translated as penny or shilling or something along those lines. According to Tenney, in actual monetary value, at least as of 65, a denarius is worth about 17 cents in U.S. Money. However, back then, the purchasing power of a denarius was significant. It was equal to about 1 day's wage. So one denarius was a big deal. Now, what was so interesting financially is that as the empire grew and expanded, and it took over these locales, they already would have a money system in place, right? They'd have their own coins. They'd have all of that. And so what do you do as the empire? Do you say, well, you got to burn it all and you got to get it all out of circulation? Nope. You decide which of those is a denarius and which of those is a pound. And now they're a denarius and they're a pound. Well, what about travel? What happens now? Well, when you go from province to province and they all have their different coinage, what you have to do then is you have to go find somebody that's called a money changer. And the money changer would help you exchange your local coins for the place that you were at now and to get their coins so that you knew that you weren't going to be cheated and the person you were, buying from knew that you weren't trying to cheat them. Except that middle guy, the money changer, he was making his profit. He was taking his cut. He was corrupt, crazy corruption, which when you start wrapping your mind around this and you start thinking about, where was Jerusalem? What was kind of the placing of it? Here's Jerusalem, the crossroads of the empire. Tons of people coming in, coming out. You have Jewish people coming on pilgrimage from all over the empire for festivals to worship at temple. And so where do the money changers find themselves? In the temple courts. Doing what? Taking advantage of the people coming in to get their money changed. It was a corrupt, horrible practice, and it was happening in the courts of the temple, the place of prayer, our Father's house. And so now you think about that story of Jesus coming to the temple and clearing it of the money changers. It makes a lot more sense. It's not just Jesus walking in and being like, people are selling things. I'm angry. I hate capitalism. That's not what was going on. He walked in and saw injustice taking place because that's what the money changers were doing. They were taking advantage of people and they were corrupt. And they were in a very real sense stealing those people's money in the very shadow of the house of God. And so when you wrap your mind around that, it changes the dynamic of that story. Because the issue there was significant economic injustice. If you wanted to make money quick, you got into the money changing business because you could take advantage of people, and Jesus undid that. So that was, so that's kind of the finance kind of thing. We've already hit on the Roman roads as far as that was the primary way that folks traveled. But the way that goods were moved around were primarily through shipping in the ocean. There were some barges that took advantage of the rivers and tributaries, but we don't catch much of that in the New Testament. We don't even have a lot of evidence of that in just kind of the general history. Most of the shipping was done via the Mediterranean and those larger bodies of water. We see Paul throughout. He's on boats all the time. In Alexandria, had some of the best. And, we see Paul on 2 Alexandrian merchant ships in the book of Acts, right? We catch them in Acts chapter 27, verse 6. And then he's rescued in Acts chapter 28, verse 11 by another Alexandrian ship. And that one we know the name of is the 2 brothers. So, that's kind of how they got around. This is kind of the economic and social world of the New Testament. And so next week we will dive into the religious world. The first thing we're going to look at is the non-Jewish religious world. So kind of just general Roman society and what were some of the religious perspectives there. And then in 2 weeks, we will spend some time looking at Judaism and first century Judaism and how it, kind of the role it played. And we may need to split that up into a couple of weeks because there's just a lot there, and it is really, really important to try to wrap our head around it. It's not as clean cut as maybe some fundamentalist Christians want to make biblical Judaism or biblical first century Judaism to be. So as we wrap this up this week, do you guys have any questions about anything that we talked about tonight?
Very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You were talking about the money changers.
Yeah.
And you said that when the Romans would take over other countries or whatever, that they would decide what was a denarius and what was a pound. What I didn't quite get was, how did the money changers end up in the temple courts?
Yeah.
Why?
So they would, so when pilgrims would come, I mean, the temple court, the temple was really kind of the center of it, and still is the center of Jerusalem. And, so if you wanted to have access to the most people, the easiest, and if you were a traveler, probably the first place you would show up to are the temple courts. You would go there first. And so it was just good business. It was just smart. They're like, hey, here's the crossroads. Here's where everybody's showing up. Let's go there. And our clientele will just come to us. We'll set up shop right here where everybody's coming. And so that's why they set up shop there.
Okay.
And and you need it. And it's so sad. Like it's one of those things where it's a good idea that got so corrupted, right? Because for the Roman Empire to try to take out these different provinces' coins from circulation would have been impossible considering the scale of the Roman Empire. And so you needed this group of people who knew that, okay, over here in Alexandria, that coin is a denarius. And here in Jerusalem, this coin is a denarius. And so you needed that person. But it was run amok by greed. I mean, and so, showing up in the temple just made a lot of good sense. It was good business.
Weren't they there to also buy an offering?
Yeah.
They went to the temple so they could buy an offering to make. So that's one reason, because they couldn't, if they had traveled quite a ways, they couldn't bring a lamb or whatever it was with them. So they had to buy one there, right?
Yep.
That's why I always understood why they were there. That was my background. I always thought that's why they were there. I didn't realize that it was sort of a general thing for exchange.
Yeah, and it's interesting because people are buying and selling offerings, but the real issue, behind all of it was were the money changers.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
I thought it was
Because
offering.
that's the that is the when you have these money changers that are doing this. It was so unjust. And for it to be done in the context of the temple, it just, Jesus couldn't, he couldn't stand it, you know? So anything else?
Nope, it's
Nope.
not.
All right. Sounds good. Well, then we'll be back next week. For those of you listening to this afterwards, boy, we'd love to have you as a part of this time together on Wednesday night, starting at 7:00, so you can ask questions and be a part of the conversation. And otherwise, please share this episode with your friends. And until next time, love well.